A Maamtrasna in 1882 was a place you'd imagine on a postcard from the past. It was a secluded valley tucked away on the border of Galway and Mayo. Life here was hard, certainly, but it moved at its own pace, dictated by the seasons and the land. People spoke Irish. They knew their neighbours. They lived in small, whitewashed cottages dotted across the rugged landscape. There was a sense of community, a rhythm to daily existence that had likely remained unchanged for generations. It was a world away from the hustle and bustle of Dublin or London, a quiet corner of Ireland where the biggest dramas were usually about livestock or the weather. It felt, from the outside, like a place where nothing truly terrible could ever happen. It was a quiet existence, built on familiarity and the shared struggles of rural life. That sense of peace was utterly shattered on the night of 17th of August, 1882. The news spread like wildfire through the misty glens and boglands. A family had been attacked in their own home, not just attacked, but brutally murdered. The victims were the Joyce family, John Joyce, his wife Bridget, his mother Margaret and his daughter Peggy. They were found in their small cottage, their home turned into a scene of unimaginable violence. The community was plunged into a state of shock and disbelief. This wasn't a crime committed by a stranger passing through. The feeling was that the perpetrators had to be local. Suddenly, every neighbour was a potential suspect, and every shadow held a new kind of fear. The details of the attack were horrifying, and they bespoke a chilling level of ferocity. The attackers had burst into the Joyce family's small two-room cottage in the dead of night. They had used firearms and blunt instruments. John, Bridget, Margaret, and Peggy were killed. Two of the sons, Michael and Patsy, were also attacked, but somehow survived their terrible injuries. Patsy, just 10 years old, would later become a key witness, his testimony shaped by trauma and fear. The sheer brutality of the act sent a wave of terror through the isolated community. This wasn't robbery. It was something else, something much darker. It felt personal, like a brutal settling of scores that had torn the fabric of their world apart. The shock quickly curdled into a pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion. In such a tight-knit community, a crime of this magnitude turned everyone inward. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut. Conversations in the local pubs fell silent when newcomers entered. The Royal Irish Constabulary, the police force of the time, descended on the valley, but they were outsiders. They didn't speak the language of the locals, Irish, and they didn't understand the complex web of relationships, loyalties, and old grudges that defined life in Maamtrasna. The investigation was immediately hampered by a wall of silence, built from a genuine fear of the killers and a deep-seated mistrust of the authorities. The peace of the valley was gone, replaced by a haunting, fearful silence. The police were under immense pressure to solve the case. The murders were a sensation, reported with lurid detail in newspapers across Britain and Ireland. The authorities needed culprits, and they needed them quickly. Their investigation, however, was on shaky ground from the start. They relied heavily on informants, individuals who were often motivated by personal gain or settling old scores. Two local men came forward, Anthony Philbin and Thomas Casey, offering to name the killers in exchange for reward money. Their stories were inconsistent, but they gave the police what they wanted: a list of names. Within days, 10 men from the surrounding area were arrested and charged with the murders. The problem was the evidence, or rather the distinct lack of it. There were no forensic clues in the modern sense. The case against the 10 men rested almost entirely on the testimony of the 2 informants and the 2 young survivors, Michael and Patsy Joyce. The boys' accounts were understandably confused, given the trauma they had endured. The arrested men all protested their innocence, but they were trapped. They were poor Irish-speaking farmers up against the full might of the British legal system. The community, terrified of being implicated, offered them little support. It felt less like a careful investigation and more like a desperate trawl, pulling in anyone who could plausibly be connected to the crime, however tenuously. One of the men arrested was Miles Joyce. He was a local man, related to the murdered family, but he maintained he was nowhere near the cottage on that fateful night. Like the others, he found himself caught in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. The police investigation was driven by a narrative that had been handed to them by the informants. Any evidence that didn't fit this narrative was seemingly ignored. The focus wasn't on uncovering the truth of what happened, but on securing convictions for the men who had been named. This led to a situation where the accused were presumed guilty, and the entire process was about confirming that guilt, not testing it. The fear in the community was palpable. People were scared of the killers, who might still be at large, but they were also scared of the police. To be seen talking to one of the accused men's families could bring suspicion upon yourself. To question the official story was to risk being labelled a sympathizer, or worse, an accomplice. This climate of fear created a perfect storm for injustice. It silenced potential witnesses who might have provided alibis for the accused. The police were not just investigating a crime, they were imposing order on a community they viewed as unruly and secretive. And the 10 arrested men became symbols of that effort. The trial that followed in Dublin was a masterclass in judicial confusion and manipulation. The most significant barrier was language. The accused men, including Miles Joyce, spoke only Irish. The court, however, operated entirely in English. The translators provided were often inadequate, struggling with local dialects and legal terminology. The men in the dock could barely understand the proceedings, let alone the complex legal arguments being made against them. They were passive observers at their own trial, unable to properly instruct their legal counsel or challenge the testimony being presented. Their fate was being decided in a language they did not comprehend. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the star witnesses, the informants. Under intense pressure and likely coached by the authorities, their stories began to change. 2 of the accused men were persuaded to turn state's evidence against the others, becoming what were known as approvers. They confessed to their involvement and implicated the remaining 8 men, including Miles Joyce, in exchange for their own freedom. Their testimony, delivered in a packed and hostile courtroom, sealed the fate of their former neighbours. It was a classic prisoner's dilemma where self-preservation trumped loyalty and truth. The remaining men watched, bewildered, as their friends condemned them. Adding another layer of complexity was the Prevention of Crime Ireland Act 1882. This was a new and controversial piece of legislation, rushed through Parliament in the wake of other high-profile murders in Dublin. It gave the authorities sweeping powers, including the ability to hold trials without a jury. For the Maamtrasna case, the trial was moved to Dublin and held before a panel of judges and a specially selected jury of English-speaking Protestant city dwellers who had little in common with the accused. This special jury was far more likely to trust the word of the police and the English-speaking witnesses over that of the Gaelic-speaking peasants in the dock. The deck was stacked against them from the very beginning. Faced with the seemingly irrefutable testimony of the approvers, the remaining men were advised by their own priests and lawyers to plead guilty. It was presented as their only hope of avoiding the gallows. 5 of them did so, and their death sentences were commuted to penal servitude. But 3 men, including Miles Joyce, refused. They maintained their innocence to the very end. The jury took just minutes to find them guilty. The verdict was delivered, and the 3 men were sentenced to death by hanging. The trial was over, but the sense of a profound injustice having been committed was only just beginning to take hold. The executions of Miles Joyce, Patrick Casey and Patrick Joyce took place at Galway Jail. The 2 approvers who had testified against them later recanted their stories, admitting they had lied under immense pressure. One of them, Thomas Casey, swore an affidavit stating that Miles Joyce was entirely innocent. He claimed he had not seen him on the night of the murders. This dramatic confession was presented to the Lord Lieutenant for Ireland, the highest authority, but it was dismissed. The executions went ahead as planned. The steadfast denial of guilt from Miles Joyce, even as he stood on the gallows, left a particularly bitter taste. His final words, spoken in Irish, were reportedly, "I am as innocent as the child in the cradle." The aftermath of the trial and executions left a deep scar on the community of Maamtrasna and on the Irish national consciousness. The case became a symbol of British injustice in Ireland, a story of poor Irish-speaking men railroaded by a system that was deaf to their language and blind to their innocence. For over a century, the story was kept alive through folk memory, ballads, and the work of campaigners who refused to let the injustice fade. The feeling persisted that the real killers had gotten away with it and that innocent men had paid the ultimate price. The name Maamtrasna became synonymous with wrongful conviction and the brutal power of the state. The story took a remarkable turn in 2018, 136 years after the trial. Following a detailed academic review of the case, Michael D. Higgins, the President of Ireland, issued a formal pardon for Miles Joyce. It was a posthumous pardon, a symbolic but hugely significant act. It officially acknowledged that a grave miscarriage of justice had occurred. For the descendants of Miles Joyce and for the wider community, it was a moment of profound validation. It confirmed what their ancestors had always believed, that an innocent man had been hanged. The pardon closed one chapter of the story, the chapter about the wrongful conviction, but it opened up others. Even with the pardon, fundamental questions about the Maamtrasna murders remain unanswered. If Miles Joyce and some of the others were innocent, then who were the real killers? And what was their motive? Theories have swirled for decades, many pointing towards the involvement of local secret societies, agrarian groups who enforced their own brutal form of justice. Was John Joyce an informer, a land grabber, or had he stolen sheep, as was rumoured? The pardon for Miles Joyce corrected a legal wrong, but the historical truth of that night remains shrouded in the same mist that covers the Maamtrasna Valley. It forces us to ask a difficult question. When the legal system fails so spectacularly, what does justice truly mean?